Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
As little as long ago, or as far away as forever. This is where we meet to celebrate what never was as it comes to pass. Welcome, friends. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio, and we're broadcasting for the next 2 hours, and we come to you every Wednesday evening, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern on Studio B. Thank those of you that have taken time to join us this evening and that are in the chat room. Welcome, and thank you for the fellowship. I consider you to be very wise in your research, and as you learn from me, I also learn from you. Today, I have as guests with me for the next 2 hours and also for the next 3 Wednesdays, Peter Moon, who's the author of several books, and he's the publisher over there at Sky Books as well. And he's got a very unique and interesting connection to not only the Preston Nichols and the Montauk experiments, and but also with the Buscegi, I believe is the name, the way that you say it, the Hall of Records that was discovered, which is said to be 50,000 years old over there in Romania, and which broke, it seems, over a decade ago, even though it's still an ongoing story and something that the world is still waking up to. And it's, I believe, to be a very important event, and it certainly seems to um, connect to the prior times in some form of fashion. And so I'm hoping to gain further introspection as far as what Peter can share with us. I know that there are some things that are still hush hush and related to this story, but whatever you can elaborate on would be greatly appreciated. Peter, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. And well, before we go into discourse on those things that we've been talking about and mentioned, would you give out your website information where people can go to find your many different books? And if you would tell us how many you've published, because you are a very prolific writer.
Well, there's 20 books that I've published. I've authored or co-authored about 15 or 16 of them, and 16, I think. And the website to look at the books, the brief description of the books and see the covers is skybooks.usa.com, skybooks.usa.com. And to access our free videos on the new series, Time Travel Theory Explained, go to digitalmontauk.com, and the lead post there, you'll go right, it'll tell you how to access these videos. There's 7 videos that explain the math and physics of time travel.
Excellent. Well, for those that maybe have not heard of Preston Nichols and Al Bielek and the story in connected with Montauk and its connections to the Philadelphia experiment and others, would you mind sharing kind of a brief synopsis on that story, and also kind of talk about what it was that you learned in in studying and just examining that whole occurrence.
Okay. First thing I'm going to say is, in very short order, within a month's time, I will be releasing a 5-6 minute video synopsis of the Montauk Project Experiments in Time, the first book that I co-wrote and published with Preston Nichols. And then the second book, Montauk Revisited, Adventures in Synchronicity, Pyramids of Montauk, the Black Sun, and also a short 5-minute video on the Montauk Pulse newsletter, which is still in print today. It's been in print over 23 years, and it keeps people up to date on the events that I've been involved in. So there will be a way to get people up to a date on this stuff, or at least a mini introduction in 5 minutes on video with pictures and whatnot. So that's been being worked on for the last month, and it's coming, to a finish. Now, to address your question, the Montauk Project Experiments in Time, which I learned about from Preston Nichols after attending a meeting of the Long Island chapter of the U.S. Psychotronics Association on Long Island in November 7th, 1990. That's when I met Preston Nichols. And since then, it took me about 6 months of going to those meetings. They'd have 2 every month to learn a lot of the different legends, lore, stories, and also meeting some of the people who were either involved or peripherally involved. And this was not broadcast for public dissemination. In fact, when we were hearing this information, and of course it's about time travel experiments and mind control experiments that accompanied the time travel, it felt like we were in Faneuil Hall in Boston, which is known as the Cradle of Liberty in Boston. This is where the fathers or the sons of liberty plotted against the British government. That's what it felt like. The era of conspiracy was so thick you could cut it with a knife. That nowadays it's, anybody can talk about conspiracy, and it's not that you couldn't talk about it, but it just felt like the paradigm was had not shifted, and we were like, the stuff we were talking about was so over the edge of what was then considered to be reality. So in any case, I met Preston, and he talked about the Montauk Project, and he was giving it was a panel discussion on Earth changes. Next to him was Duncan Cameron, who was the lead psychic in the Montauk experiments. And basically, and in the audience that night next to me was Al Bielik, who I met. The Montauk Project was a catch-all phrase for vast amounts of experimentation that was done starting in the 1940s after the aftermath of the Philadelphia experiment, which was an experiment when the Navy was monkeying around with a ship called the USS Eldridge and attempting to make it appear invisible to radar. And it did much more than appear invisible to radar. It disappeared and it moved in time. And the tragedy of the Philadelphia experiment was for the people on board, the sailors, who were put into what I could now describe as the boundary layer between self-contained or soliton field, which basically accompanied one rate of time, and the outside world, which consisted of another rate of time. And between these two, this bubble reality, or these two rates of time, was a field of energy that was basically irradiated, and it hurt the sailors who were in it or close to it. And it not only could hurt them physically, in some cases where they were just close to it, it discombobulated them mentally. So the physical, mental, and emotional trauma that accompanied this experiment, the sailors after 1943 were taken to Camp Upton in Long Island, New York, which was to be the home of, actually became Brookhaven National Laboratory, the foremost laboratory on atomic science at the time, and it still is. And it was actually a bunch of universities that owned it. Now it's actually owned by the Department of Energy in the U.S. government. So that was the beginning of the Montauk Project, when they were studying these sailors, and then as they began to study them further, they began to try and link their minds and affect it with radio frequency. And this was connecting the mind of man to radio frequency, amplification of radio frequency, and also connecting it to computers. Because the man who ran this project, John von Neumann, was one of the fathers of computer science. So this project took place in the late 40s, early 50s, and carried forward to 1958, when there was the government ordered the product shut down because of the mind control aspects, but it went under the table, and it reemerged in the early 70s at the end of Long Island, eastern end of Long Island, Montauk Point, where there was an Air Force station that had a huge radar reflector that operated at what's called the window frequency to the human consciousness, 435 megahertz, or anywhere approximately 420 to 450 megahertz. And this was, they were able to basically have a psychic who was mentally adept, who could broadcast thoughts that would be amplified and transmitted out of that, the gain horn of the radar reflector, which is basically a transmitter. The radar reflector would transmit and it would also receive. But it would affect the local population, it would affect the animals, and this sort of thing. And eventually, if you can affect moods and you can affect matter, which they could affect matter, they were able to affect time. And this was, the accounts of the experiments are varied, they're subjective, but there's enough circumstantial evidence to know that a project of a highly irregular nature that followed mood control, that it allowed for mood control of human emotions. And there have been so many anecdotal accounts of time phenomena that the story has really weathered the test of decades, a score of years. And then of course now we have further examples and corroboration through the work of Dr. David Anderson, which establishes that time travel does not violate the laws of math and physics.
Well, is there anything still ongoing associated with the phenomena and with the uh, gateways or portals which were open? Is there any still residual effects lingering from the things that were done during that time?
Well, I would have to say there's always a residual.
Mm.
If you, what the Montauk Project evolved into, at least in part, was the HARP project in Alaska. It evolved into this, huge, multi-layered program that affects the Earth's atmosphere. It affects God knows what. The HARP project is multi-layered, as all these government projects are that are of a highly esoteric nature. So that does not mean that everything in the Montauk Project evolved into the HARP project and it didn't siphon off into somewhere else. But when you talk about a residual, I will tell you this. My two members of my family were in town, and to my surprise, they wanted to go to Montauk. I said, oh, okay. I hadn't been there since last year. And so we went out to Montauk, and he just sent me a picture today and I said, well, he says, Montauk Energy, he says. And I said, what was that? My gosh. I said, was that the sun? He says, no, that wasn't the sun. The sun wasn't in that direction. So he gets this like weird, God, it looked like a globe of light. Now, there were pictures taken out there a year ago where they had these blue they weren't orbs. You'll often see blue orbs in certain pictures around certain highly charged areas. These were like, they were a little bit like the blue orbs, except they looked like sort of like big lips kissing, like really fat lips kissing. And so that there is phenomena out there. Most definitely there's phenomena out there, and there will probably always be phenomena out there.
Do you think that something like the Bermuda Triangle was created or opened, and that is still, still ongoing and affecting even time space now in that particular area?
The commonalities, I mean, in the, I do not consider myself that studied up on the Bermuda Triangle,
Mhm.
but from what, and there's even been arguments that it's, in any region of space that had that much traffic flying through it, it would have that much odd occurrences. But let's just assume that the occurrences in the Bermuda Triangle are odd. Well, it could be any number of things, but the most, I guess, what you'd say, I wouldn't call it conventional. I would call it, alternative traditional would be that it was a giant crystal underneath that represented the Atlantean culture. That was underneath the ocean that was askew, and that's one explanation that's been offered. Montauk itself is said to be an ancient Atlantean mountaintop. Keep in mind that Montauk is a mountain. It is not a part of Long Island geographically. It is actually an island, and it is the connection between Montauk and Long Island is called the Napeague Strip. For all practical purposes, if you're driving along, it'll look like land, but it's really an isthmus that was filled in. So basically you have a different geological structure. Now, when I say Atlantis, it's very important to realize that Atlantis is more of a time period than it is an island or a continent. And it was a culture that is, I think its last remnants are said to be, and as I say, I don't consider myself expert on this topic, 10,000 years ago. And there were different variations of Atlantis, just like there were different variations of Egypt. So yeah, there is perhaps technology that went askew in many different areas of the planet.
Well, you had mentioned HARP, and then you said that it was multi-layered. Can you elaborate? What do you think is, what's connected to HARP? What are they actually doing on any kind of metaphysical level, or is it weather manipulation? Some say it's an earthquake machine. I mean, what's your take on it?
Well, the early, and again, I'm not going to call myself an expert on the HARP project, but what I
Right.
will say is that the Montauk project, as in the book Montauk Project Experiments in Time, there was also additional research which was done in tandem with the psychological research, or us not necessarily interfacing with it directly, but it was very much connected, and that had to do with the weather. That had to do
Uh-huh.
with radiosondes and sending out balloons and monitoring the atmosphere and whatnot. Now, it was doing through a technique that Wilhelm Reich called orgone energy. And orgone energy is basically like chi energy or life energy. Chinese call it chi energy. And he was basically weather and human emotions and moods are very much connected. I mean, and even physiology. So when you manipulate the weather, you can manipulate emotions. When
Hmm.
you theoretically, you could manipulate the weather by manipulating emotions, like with a very bad vibe. You can see like, and say in the story of the New Testament, there's an eclipse and a storm when Jesus is crucified. So
Hmm.
you have in a case like that, if you want to buy into the story or even into the drama, you see that this is like, oh, it's like, something very negative has happened. So you feel the impending, not just the impending doom, but the weather becomes doomful. So the HARP project is something that is ostensibly can be utilized to affect the weather and or emotions. And does it have does it use cell phone points, cell phone towers to relay such? These things I'm not an expert on. I can't say this would be an obvious conclusion. But there also some of the most interesting comments I've seen about HARP are by Douglas Dietrich, one of your fellow hosts on Revolution Radio, who was sent to, I think it was Folsom State University. I think that was the name of it. But where he was there to basically serve as undercover to watch what the journalists were coming up with on this topic. And basically, one of the functions he talks about was that it was actually to deal with entities or capture entities.
Hmm.
So this is, by the way, this sort of technology using electronics and radio waves is completely in alignment with what L. Ron Hubbard talked about in the early 1950s in his early works on the subject of Scientology, that electronics would be used to affect spiritual beings, to drag spiritual beings down into the realm of earth-based beings and to control them with electronics. His proposition being that spiritual beings were inherently free to come and go and do what they'd like, but the physical based beings would were dead set on entrapping them. Now, as they say, Dietrich's who was very, I guess, learned and schooled and had to put up with a certain amount of demonology in his work at the Presidio as a research librarian. But so I thought that what he said was very interesting about this, that we're talking about dealing with emotions. Well, when you're dealing with emotions, you're also ultimately dealing with spirits. That's what I have to say about HARP.
Okay, well, interesting. Before we leave the story of Montauk, would you mind speaking a little bit about its connections to time travel and what had occurred with Duncan and Al?
Well, according to the legend / story / history, Al Bielek, who was living as Edward Cameron, and his brother Duncan Cameron were aboard the USS Eldridge. They were in the, I want to call it the command center, but they were shielded by all of the phenomena that was going on around them. And they realized that they needed to jump ship if they wanted to survive this. And they basically jumped over the ship and they landed at Montauk in 1983. Now, this is these conclusions were arrived at in, I guess, what you call like trying to piece together the memory of one's life. And Duncan, who was very gifted as a psychic in a very unique way, put all this stuff together. And then Al Bielek came up with the conclusion entirely separately that he was the brother of Duncan. And when he told Preston and Duncan, who he did not know very well at that time, they said, well, yes, we know, Al, we came up with this conclusion on our part, but we didn't want to say anything to you. So this was, and there was always sort of a magic when you get the three of them together and get them talking on this subject. It would kind of congeal in the most unique manner or way. It would have a credibility because of the debris of emotions and experience that all three had experienced. So they went to Montauk in 1983, and then there were different issues that had to be dealt with, where they were greeted by the scientist John von Neumann, who officially died in 1957. So you don't know if von Neumann is really the same von Neumann or a time traveler, or what he is, or even if the story is 100% accurate. But what we do have in the story is Al Bielek or Duncan Edward Cameron going back to 1943, and Duncan staying in 1983, and basically, I guess, rapidly dying because his body was aging very fast. And according to the story, they took him and were able to transmigrate his spirit from the body he was in as Duncan Cameron to which would, I guess, would be his half brother, another Duncan Cameron by the same father, Alexander Duncan Cameron Sr., who had a new wife by this time, and who was very wrapped up in a lot of strange business himself. So that's and then in the process, what they were doing with the researchers was connecting up the two projects, the Philadelphia experiment of 1943 and the Montauk project, which would climax in 83, both in the month of August. August 12th was the date that is given. So what I've learned since is that when you have two, this is from the work of David Anderson, when you have two rotating masses, or rotating fields of energy, there's going to be a discharge between them. And that discharge could also, under the right circumstances, facilitate a literal closed time-like curve, or a series of closed time-like curves which would enable one to travel through time. So the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk project are now no longer have to be relegated to science fiction. It doesn't mean they're true. It doesn't mean they're not true. But without these wild stories, I never would have gotten to the point where we have the science, and I understand.
All right, hold on, Peter. We'll be right back, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody. I'd like to go ahead and go into the story of Transylvania Sunrise, if you don't mind. And if you would, in presenting the information to kind of set the background and the foundation for what we're going to be talking about in the rest of the show, if you would talk about who Radu Cinemar is, and Al, how you became acquainted with this story.
Okay. First, we have to address some background. Is that I was talking about the two experiments hooking up on August 12th in 1943 and 1983.
Yes.
In every year during that time period, there is supposed to be, or there is what's called a biorhythm, that is a cycle of energy that flows throughout the planet. And of course, it's going to be more accentuated at certain points, or ley lines, or sensitive points. And this is much like the meridians, Chinese meridian system in the body. And in addition to the meridians that most people are familiar with, there is called regulatory channels. They're called regulatory channels in the body that, the things flow. So every year between the 10th of August and the 14th of August, that's an approximate window, there will be this energy on the planet, and there is a major biorhythm every 20 years and a lesser biorhythm every 10 years, and still a biorhythm. It may not be as strong as the others every year during this time period. Now, in 1999, during that time period of August, there was an eclipse and a grand cross which meant like a major dynamic change was going to take place. And on 11th August 1999, a man walked into our monthly Montauk night. His name was Dr. David Anderson, and he didn't introduce himself until after the meeting. He introduced himself privately to me and said he would like to work with me. And we got together a week later, and he had just returned before that meeting from Romania, where he was asked to lecture at a camp called Atlanticron that meets in the Danube every year. And he decided to set up a charitable foundation, which he did, which is now called the World Genesis Foundation. You can look that up if you're interested. And I now serve on the board of that. It's basically to make sure that every child has an opportunity. That's the purpose of the foundation. And most of the work is done in Romania. And there is also work done in other countries. But primarily Romania is the focus, has been the focus, where there's a camp every year. Now, David started this foundation, but he just introduced himself to me that particular evening and that day, and he says, I want to get you to Romania. Now, in the meantime, I had been solicited by an individual who used to be an editor at a Romanian publishing house, who was asked to review the Montauk Project by his boss. And he says, should I publish it? And he says, yes, you should publish it. The boss decided he didn't want to publish it. So this individual, Sorin Hormuz, went off on his own and started his own publishing house. He's at a very successful publishing house based upon initially the Montauk Project. And I insisted that I gave him the rights to, made a deal with him for the rights, but I said, just dedicate this book to Dr. David Anderson, the Romanian edition. So Sorin would eventually meet David, and he would send me a video of David Anderson on Bucharest TV, where he was talking about 10 million or 6 billion or 10 billion, I don't remember which it was being invested in time travel research every year. He was saying this on Bucharest TV, and he was saying that, if you don't believe that, you're very naive. But basically, Sorin, who had published the book in Romanian, was then contacted by a person in the secret government of Romania who asked, I have a book. I would like to know if you'd like to publish it. Sure, send me the book. He sent him the book, and this is the book that became Transylvania Sunrise. And this was Radu Cinemar was the author. And Sorin said, he sent it to me. He actually went to the trouble to have it translated into English and shipped to me. And that book sat on my desk for 4 years. For 4 years, because I started it, but I never had time to finish it. I was working on other projects. So in the meantime, David had a time travel research center in Long Island and one in New Mexico. 9/11 happened. It pressured him to close the one in Long Island, to go underground, and to disassociate himself from the time travel center in New Mexico. He did have one in Romania that was basically theoretical. So I really don't know much about the theoretical center, but he used that theoretical center in Romania because Romania has the best mathematicians in the world. So in any case, what David told me, I had met with him in Rochester, New York with Preston Nichols, and he was giving me all of the stuff from his time travel research center, which was basically books and paintings. He was creating a museum. It had very little sensitive data in it. So basically, Preston and I went up there in Preston's van. We put it all in the van, and David said, we invited him out to dinner. He says, no, I have to go, which was very disappointing. But he did say, he says, I won't be able to work with you for 5 years. So here I finally read the book under circumstances of a broken down car and having my car repaired. I had time to, and it was in Brooklyn. I was having a friend repair it for me um, in the bowels of Brooklyn. And so I'm in this really almost closet-like space. It's bigger than a closet, but I'm reading this manuscript and I'm getting it. It's like, wow. A friend of mine had read it when he was staying at my house. He says, "You've got to publish this book." So I read it, and I began negotiations with the publisher, Serene Hormuz. It took about 4 months to tighten up the negotiations, so we both agreed on it. And right after I completed the negotiation, I got a surprise email from David Anderson. It was 5 years to the month. And he says, "How would you like to go to Romania?" And I said, "Wow." And so then he called me to prepare the trip about a month later. And he said, we had a long talk, and he says, "What would you like to do when you're in Romania?" He says, "We will sponsor a 3-day cultural tour for you, but what would you like to do?" I said, "Well, I read the book." I said, "I want to see this Hall of Records." And I said, "Do you know what I'm talking about?" He says, he didn't know what I was talking about at first until I mentioned Radu Cinema and explained the situation. He says, "Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about." So he used all of his contacts, and they ended up referring him back to my publisher, which was this big circle. And it was, he later confided to me that people said that he knew Radu. So in any case, I went over there, and I said, "What do you know about this?" He says, "We'll talk about that when you get here. I don't feel comfortable talking on the phone." So his statement kind of led me to believe that there would be a lot of revelation, that he would know a lot. But when I got to Romania in 2008, it was very disappointing, because first off, our rooms were sold out. We had to we were driving around. We arrived at 2 a.m. They were driving us all around. We checked into a hotel up in the mountains because they couldn't find us a hotel because we arrived late. They sold out our rooms. So we got, very tired. We got in bed at 6 p.m., slept, woke up the next morning with no contact, no people. No, what the hell are we doing here? So we had to struggle to contact our, David and our Romanian person, and we had to struggle to get a new room, go down to the city, and it was very tough. And when you ask a question in English and you ask something, they will point in the opposite direction, not purposefully, but it's just like, it was very frustrating. So in any case, when I finally arrived at the camp, David really didn't have anything to say, and he had to be quiet. And finally, after a lot of drama that wasn't centered around that, he told me that he was going to be back in the time travel business, and he would release some new information that following December, which he did. And much of that is now on his website, and andersoninstitute.com. The following year, he lectured on time travel, and he had me lecture with him like a tag team. I would lecture on different topics, and he was discussing much of the science, and it involved a personal tutoring session from him to me on the concept of the invariance of the space-time interval, which is now part of these explained very concisely in these video series that I put up for free, Time Travel Theory Explained. So this was an education taking place. A lot of the stuff he said I didn't quite grasp at the time, but this still doesn't really get back to the question of the book Transylvania Sunrise. But it does explain in the midst, I should add, in the midst of this bizarre trip, which was really more disappointing than it was revealing. It introduced me to Romania. The first trip, I did, my publisher had driven 2 hours plus from Bucharest to the camp to see me. Now, when he came to see me, I wasn't there because I was sick in an apartment where I was staying because I'd eaten what was called fish head soup. Now, I don't like fish head soup any more than you or the audience does. and this is kind of a joke. We talk about the fish head soup. There was also fish served at that meal, and you don't eat fish that's caught in the Danube because unless you're really native to that area, it's like Montezuma's Revenge. So I got very sick as a result of that. And Serene came to my apartment, knocked on the door, and we talked. We got along really good. We get along really good. And he had a CD from Radu for me that gave told me about some things he had to say. Now, which really wasn't a whole too much different from the book. I should listen to it again. But in any case, the book, this was sort of my introduction to Romania. I've glossed over one key part, which is probably a very important part. And when I was lost in this, we were displaced, lost. We had a taxi driver we thought was going to drive us all around. He takes us to this castle called Peles Castle in the city of Sinaia and dumps us. We said, oh yeah, well, we wanted to take you out to lunch. Oh no, I've got to go. I've got other places to go. We thought he was our tour guide. This is how disoriented. So he dumps us in the castle, and we said, well, how the hell do we get home? And we ended up walking all the way home, and
oh my gosh,
way home. And I have a good homing device in my inner sense, so I was able to find the way home. There were three of us, and we were all Americans. And so basically, at the Peles Castle, we were this beggar comes up to me, and the beggar comes up, and he was a very unusual looking man, and he's obviously a beggar, but he doesn't look like a beggar. He's not dressed like a beggar, and I kind of look at him, and I don't have any coins that are of any value to him. I don't have any Romanian money on me, so I'm thinking and the money that I did have, I might have had some Romanian money, but that was all. I was like the treasurer for the trip. I had to keep it for everybody. So I was not, inclined. Plus, also coming from New York, I am there's a whole game that goes on with beggars. And they used to have a begging school in New York where they teach people how to beg. And it was, and they weren't real beggars. They were professional beggars. They weren't homeless people. They would pose as homeless people. So I was not very, what you call beggar friendly. And in any case, it was a mistake on my part not to give this beggar any money. And it took me about a year to realize this, based upon my friend Tantra Bensko, who was there. She sent me this website, and there's an ancient tradition in Romania. And if anybody has applied this tradition as well as me, I'd like to meet them, because the tradition in Romania is that the indigenous spirits, known as the Solomonari, will disguise themselves as beggars or shepherds, and they will come out of the earth. In the case of the Solomonari, they'll disguise themselves, come out of the inner earth, and they will test your heart. And they will test your heart by asking you for something, for money. So, and then if you give them something, they will open up the heart of Romania to you.
interesting.
So, yes, now this is what all of these stories that have come out into books and that were written in the Romanian language had been translated into the English language by myself. I'm not the translator, but I've hired the translators, except for the first book. And then I do the editing for the English so that they make intelligible sense. But these books serve as an initiation of this ancient tradition of the Solomonari, who would initiate their god, Zalmoxes. They would initiate this man, Zalmoxes, and turn him into a god. 4 years of initiation in a cave. Now, these books do not mention Zalmoxes. They do not mention the Solomonari, except where I chime in my part of the book and mention them. But I have, if these are not a creation of those indigenous spirits, these books They are, uh, they emulate it. They parallel it to a T. So this is a very important part that the casual reader is not going to understand or know. And I say I made a mistake by not uh, giving this beggar a coin, and it wasn't that my heart was closed. It was that um, I came from a different environment, because the environment in Romania is completely different than America and New York City, and they weren't even a capitalistic country until fairly recently. So basically, um, this these incredible stories that come out of the work of Radu Sinamar, and they're very much tied to the inner earth. And Montauk is also tied to the inner earth, but Montauk, as far as an initiatory instrument, is very cut off and blocked as compared to, like, say, if I go out to Montauk to investigate, well, all those people out there are basically squatters who took the land from the Montauk Indians, and I'm not really was never really greeted to politely out there. In fact, people would hide. They would, they didn't throw tomatoes, but they would have been inclined to if given the opportunity. And whereas in Romania, and in particular Transylvania, I have been greeted with much hospitality and love. Uh, and to say that the heart of Romania has been open to me is an understatement.
Very interesting. We're almost to the second break, but we will spend this second hour elaborating. Um, and next show we will pick up with kind of Radu's initiation, which when I read that portion of the text, you describe it as almost being comical, and not comical in the sense of as being humorous, but comical in the sense of being supernatural, or um, just mind blowing, and something that you would see in a like a Hollywood movie, and even
The word
beyond.
is phantasmagorical.
Yes,
This is the
yes,
word he uses the word in one of the books, phantasmagorical. Yes.
yes, and so and for especially for people that are involved in this culture, which is very different, as you say, you being from New York and then going there to Romania, but our culture is very much different, and it's hard for people to grasp how a lot of people are dedicate their lives to metaphysical aspects, which are just maybe above the understanding of a lot of people that are involved in just accumulating materialistic possessions, or in striving for money, and to buy bigger houses and bigger cars, and fill these bigger houses with more and more things, and that's the focus and the drive of a lot of people's lives here. But how people dedicate themselves in other parts of the world, especially in third world nations, where there's a lot of poverty, and there's still so many that are living on less than $2 a day. How there's other focuses and other drives, almost like what is written in scripture as living for the kingdom, that people do these kind of things and have this kind of mindset. And so uh, I don't know, because you didn't describe so much as far as Radu, his previous background, but he seems to be a very spiritual and highly evolved being, which gave him opportunity. These windows opened up for him to be initiated in the way that he was, but that not a lot of people live that way. Certainly, I try to myself to live for higher things, but not a lot of people do. And so when we get to that, if you could, I don't know if you can elaborate any further as to Radu as person, and then we can go into the story of what was discovered, how it was discovered over there, and um, and also the other things that are in connection with it, which are just absolutely mind blowing. But
Sure, I'll be happy to do that.
all right, well, let's since we got 2 more minutes, if you wouldn't mind, give out your website information and where people can go to support your work once more.
Okay, I'll be happy to do that. People can buy books at skybooks.usa.com, digitalmontauk.com.
All right. Well, we'll be right back, everyone. Welcome back, everybody, for second hour. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen, and I have as guests with me this week and also for the following two, Peter Moon, who is the publisher of Skybooks and author of several. You can find a lot of his works at Amazon.com. And before we go into the topic of discussion for this evening, I just want to remind everybody that Revolution Radio is the largest listener supported, commercial free, and corporate free radio network anywhere on the internet or, as far as the earth. And so, those of you that do appreciate the various platforms that all of the hosts utilize the network for, in bringing truth and the esoteric knowledge and biblical prophecy, conspiratorial side of what's going on in world with New World Order, world government, and all of that. If you appreciate the things that we are doing and the knowledge that we are bringing forth, please, those of you that can, just go to freedomslips.com, click on the donate button, share whatever you may for the price of a Happy Meal. Those of you that actually eat McDonald's, um, you can buy access to the archives and download all of the shows going back to the beginning of last year for all of the many different hosts that come on throughout all 7 days of the week and over many, night and day. And I know that Studio EA right now, that Monica is over there, and she always has a fascinating show, and that a lot of times people are caught up on whether to listen to me or to listen to her. And in this way, you could do both. You can download the shows and listen to them later, and utilize your time if you're driving to work or jogging, and put them on your MP3 player, share them with others. It's absolutely incredible value. And so we thank you beforehand for your support. Peter, I want to go ahead and turn it back over to you and allow you to go into you know, laying the foundation for this story, and so that we can elaborate on it further, because it absolutely is a fascinating topic and one that is still little known about. And one final thing, I did share a link to this story, some of the background information with this story, how it was discovered, and its connections to the Masons and all of that. So those of you that are wanting to know more, you can do so by looking at the article and reading it later. Peter?
Well, I will. I've laid the foundation for how I ended up in Romania.
Mm-hmm.
Now I will lay the foundation for Radu and how he got involved well, not so much how he got involved, but how the story came to pass. Basically, he was met one day by this character named Caesar Brad. And Caesar Brad was a very unique and special individual. And he basically put Radu in place to tell the story, so that Radu was an independent writer. He was eventually recruited into Caesar's Department Zero, Department Zero being the most secretive and autonomous part of the Romanian power structure. but it was only the only person they had to answer to was the president. And originally it was the dictator, Ceausescu. And the only person that knew about it other than Ceausescu was the director of security, who basically was always trying to undermine Department Zero because it was out of his control. But in any case, Cesar Brad is the main character in the book Transylvania Sunrise. Radu is writing the story. Radu will have other adventures in the other books, but his adventures, he does have some adventures in this book, but they're minimal. Basically, Cesar Brad was born with a very large umbilical cord, and it was so large and it was impossible to cut. So I think they finally had to take, by normal means, they had to take a hacksaw to cut it off. And they reported this to the Securitate or security, which is what the doctor is supposed to do with anomalous type births. And they came and investigated, and they brought a Chinese doctor with them, Dr. Zhen. And Dr. Zhen was there as a cultural exchange program from Red China, which was under communists at that time. And he was there to set up their paranormal department. In return, Romania would take several Chinese students and educate them, because Romania had very good education. So this was a cultural program worked out between two communist countries that were friendly towards each other. And I should point out that Romania was much more friendly towards China and North Korea than it was to Russia. Russia had taken their crown treasures and jewels and state treasure from World War I and never returned it. Still hasn't returned it to this day. So there's, you know, the Romanians are now allied with the Americans. And so basically, Caesar was born, and he basically, there was an arrangement worked out between the security to keep an eye with the parents. They would pay the parents extra money to keep an eye on the kid and report if anything unusual happened. And, you know, when phenomena would happen, you know, Dr. Zen would come over, and Dr. Zen began to actually teach this kid until about the age of 13. He began to educate him in, you know, a special camp. And there was a special paranormal camp where he would study with other kids that were paranormal and were unusual. And Dr. Zen was in charge of basically, or supervising these kids. I wouldn't know that he was there on a day-to-day basis, but he was the overseer because he had been successful at doing this sort of thing in China. So basically, Caesar is being groomed from a very early age, if not birth, to basically take over to work in Department Zero and to eventually take it over. So he works in conjunction with a colonel who becomes a General Obadia. And Obadia is you know, he's the real head of Department Zero at that time, the military, political security head. So basically, a lot of the first part of the book is talking about how Caesar gets in this position. Then, and by the way, Department Zero was set up with private money that was being worked by the person who was, it wasn't, I think it was the person who came before Abadi, I don't remember his name. He was, he had companies in Uruguay and was operating everything out of Uruguay. And it was just, you know, not in the regular budget of the Romanian finance minister. And I know this because I met the finance minister, and he was very surprised to hear about all of this. he was the former finance minister who was now serving as in the Senate. And he said, this couldn't possibly have happened because I would have signed the budget. And I had to explain to him and, kind of opened his eyes on the whole way things operate. Because he was very highly placed in the government. He didn't know any of this. So basically, what happened when he got into this position as the head of Department Zero, he was sought out one day by a very unusual and mysterious man named Signor Mazzini. Signor Mazzini was from Italy, and he spoke fluent Romanian, which is not typical. It's not that hard, but Romanians can understand Italians. Italians have a much more difficult time with Romanian. So they don't necessarily speak the language with great fluency, but he spoke it impeccably. And he insisted that when he spoke to Caesar that they would go off in the distance away from any possible bugs. And he would basically tell Caesar that he's a Freemason. He represents Italian Freemasonry. He's very highly placed. He's a part of the Bilderberg group. And that he said that his sources in the American Pentagon had determined with ground penetrating radar that was being used from satellites that there was a chamber underneath the Romanian Sphinx. And they wanted to solicit his help in getting underneath this chamber, but it all had to be done in secret. Now, this is sort of like a Mexican standoff between the two, because Caesar understands that this guy is evil as sin, and that he wants this to get at this chamber for purposes which are power and control. And the man he's astounded that this man even knows who he is, because nobody knows who he is. How does this guy know who he is? And he knows too much. So Caesar has to play cat and mouse with him and pretend like he's complicit, because if he doesn't, he will lose his job. Now, in the meantime, all of this is being done without the knowledge of the Romanian president or the American president, which would have been George W. Bush. It's being done by a secret faction of the Pentagon, and which is connected to Freemasonry. So basically, and of course, the Pentagon has all sorts of resources and side budgets if they need it to go do strange operations. And they're bringing all this technology over to Romania to breach the chamber. It requires a lot of digging, and it's not easy. It requires an atomic laser. Now, the reason he brought the Americans into it, because they had the technology to open it, and the Romanians are the possessors of the territory. So the whole book goes into a lot of the drama of opening it up, the drama of how we got into this situation, and the drama between Mazzini and Caesar. And finally, after a long series of trials and tribulations, and a few people get fried in this energy field when they open up the first layer, and Caesar finally figures out there's a handprint that he puts his hand on, and that actually opens up the force field, so they can actually get into not the chamber itself, but the tunnel that will lead to the chamber. So it takes a long time to go into the tunnel. Now they're digging in the mountains outside the little town of Buscegi. Buscegi is a town I've been to many times. It's one way to get to the Sphinx when you take this car, but he doesn't mention it as Buscegi in the book. He just says B/ or B line and doesn't identify the town. I know it's Buscegi because I know enough about Romanian geography. It's the only place it could be. In addition to that, if you talk to people that worked in hotels during that time period, they will tell you that there was an inordinate amount of Americans there during that time. And what were these Americans do? And they were all told not to talk about it. But in any case, this chamber was eventually accessed, and inside the chamber, there were these huge tables that they were like 6 feet high. So the implication is that the beings that originally used them were gigantic compared to us. And that if you put your hand over one section of the table, it would read out your DNA on a molecular level. If you pressed it down closer to the table, it would read it out in atomic form and even perhaps subquantum. So then you had other tables which would, you put your hand over it and it would read out in holographic form a star system with a planet and then with a hologram of a certain type of species. And of course, this would indicate what planet and what star system it came from. If you put your hand over another while simultaneously holding the hand over the original one, it would read out another species, but it would also show you a blending of the two species, a hybridization. So this was an incredible, fantastic discovery that they made. And keep in mind, when this book was written, they'd only been able to penetrate this area for about 6 weeks. So it's been now dozens of years since all of, who knows what else they found out. This room also, chamber also featured a place called the projection hall, where you could see a holographic readout of the history of the world that was bioresonant with you. So if you looked at it, it would be different than if I looked at it. It would be different if somebody else looked at it. And Radu was actually allowed to get into this chamber for about an hour and report on what he saw. He saw a rendition of the history of the world for about 45 minutes, and he was given a first-hand experience glance so that he could appreciate this whole story that Caesar had told him. In addition to seeing the projection hall, there were 3 tunnels, and one tunnel went to a similar installation in Tibet, with offshoot tunnels into Mongolia, into Iraq, where again there were similar but not identical installations. And another tunnel went to the Giza Plateau, beneath the Giza Plateau in Egypt, and another, where there was another similar installation, and another third tunnel went into the inner earth. And that, in a nutshell, is sort of the bare bones of the story. There's a lot more detail and excitement and interest when you actually read the book. I wouldn't mind rereading it again myself.
Yeah, it's a absolutely fascinating story, um, which it reminds me of also. I heard about a cave system that there was a Vimana, some kind of vehicle of that sort located in the cave system, and they said that it was protected in similar fashion, and that special forces had gone in, and that 8 people had died trying to remove it or to gain access to it. And do you know about what I'm talking about?
Well, you're talking about a Vimana. That's a name for Indian craft. Are you talking about in Romania?
Right, right. And I don't know exactly where this was. I believe it was in Afghanistan. While we were there for the Afghani war, that this was located, and that they were trying to gain access to this particular craft. But a similar type of thing occurred in that there was an energetic barrier, and that 4 or 8 special forces individuals had lost their lives. And of course, none of this, can be confirmed, but there was the story rumored had come out in speaking about it. And so it just reminded me of what is described, with the energetic barrier that was protecting the hall leading to this particular projection room.
Well, this is a very good point, because in all such uh, areas where you actually have somebody that has higher knowledge, or knowledge that is affiliated with wisdom or transcendence, is there is going to be a barrier with the mundane. And this is something that shows up in the later books, where they get into this. It's an even more secret spot in Transylvania. This area is in, the way you say it is Buscegi. We'd spell it Bucegi. Americans might pronounce it Buscegi, but the way that Romanians say it is Buscegi. Buscegi Mountains, or Buscegi Mountains is how we might say it, which is on the border between Transylvania and Wallachia. In the heart of Transylvania, there is an area that is so much more highly sensitive than the area I just told you about, that when the Americans began to find out that the Romanians had a file on it, they became very indignant. Not only that the Romanians knew a little bit about it, the Romanian government, but that why on earth does this small country, which isn't that small compared to the United States, Romania is about the size of Texas. How does this country, why do they have this important location and not us? We're the great America. This is how stupid Americans are. And it's very easy to understand. Romania is a country that has its own sacred heritage and tradition. America does not have a sacred heritage and tradition. It is an invasion of Native American peoples who have a sacred heritage and tradition, and dishonors that sacred native soil of America. So the most sacredness we have are the memorials of people fighting for America, but it's on top of sacred land that has been dishonored. Some of the most sacred land is Montauk Point, New York. So this is one issue that will test the legitimacy of Donald Trump if he actually wins the election. He tried to, I don't know that he tried to, he made some serious inquiries into buying the property years ago when it was put up for sale, developing Montauk Point. But it was not allowed to be sold. So, he didn't pursue it any further. But the Montauk Indian case, how he acts in this will be a true test of his mettle as to which side of the ball is he actually on.
Mm-hmm. How do you think he's legitimate?
Oh, I think he's like everybody else. There's parts of him that are legitimate, and there's parts of him that leave something to be desired.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing is, he can talk a lot straighter than most politicians, and he can talk with, he can talk to the common man better than a politician and relate to them better, even though he really isn't a common man. So, is he legit? He is infested in a world of what I would call 666, the material empire. So if you watch that movie, I just saw it for the first time last night because I had to stay up for a late interview, The Devil's Advocate with Al Pacino.
Mm-hmm.
It basically, shows New York City society and how all these deals are built upon the devil's work.
Right.
I can't speak for Donald Trump, but I'm saying is, when you get deeply involved, I mean, he would be the first to tell you that he has an army of accountants working for him. And it's also true when you hire accountants, they know more about you than you do in terms of your business.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you kind of lose control to a certain extent, not completely. So, and your accountants are there to basically manipulate and outmaneuver the government.
Right.
So, is he legitimate? I don't know. I'm parts of him might leave something to be desired. But as I say, the issue of the Montauk Indians, who were declared extinct in 1909 by New York State, they were recently passed the legislature passed a bill to recognize them, but had all this, and then the governor vetoed it because he said the bill asked for them to use the same standards to be recognized as the United States government. We don't have the resources to do that. This was all a sham to put the Indians out on a string. And the governor is guilty of not recognizing them and violating their rights. He turned it over to the Secretary of State to look into it, who did nothing. So it's not necessarily a presidential prerogative to do anything about this issue, but it will how he responds to it, public relations wise, would be a real telltale of,
Hmm.
of his legitimacy, because the art of politics is to shuffle off, hand off the football,
Right.
and hand it off and discard it, which is effectively what the governor of New York did to the Secretary of State, who chooses to ignore the issue. Because the reason they ignore the issue, because if they acknowledge the government, or that the Montauk Indians are a legitimate tribe, which they clearly are, it all comes down to money.
Right.
And somebody's going to have to cough up money, lose money, give up money, and it's going to put money into the hands of people that are disempowered currently.
All right, we'll be right back for a final segment.
Yes.
Welcome back, everybody, for final segment. Peter, I want to share something with you. When I was reading the text, um, it led me back to something that I had read in a book called "The Book of the Bee." It's just really short, but I think you'll be interested in just hearing this. It says, then he built in front of them a strong building, and he made for it a door of brass, and anointed it within and without with oil of thesnactis, so that if they should bring iron implements near it to force it open, they would be unable to move it. And if they wished to melt it with fire, it would quench it. And it feared neither the operations of devils nor of sorcerers, and was not to be overcome by any of them.
What was that book?
It's called The Book of the Bee.
The Bee?
Yeah, The Book of the Bee. It was written by Solomon a long, long time ago, but
How do you spell bee?
Bee.
Wow. I didn't know there was a book of the bee.
I'll send you a link to it, but specifically, I'll send you a link to this chapter that I mentioned, because it actually, this particular passage talks about um, giants being trapped in the center of the earth, in in the a hollow opening in the north, what is referenced as the north, and that a door was put in place to prevent them from escaping there until the end of days. And I thought you would be interested in specifically in this passage, since you mentioned something in similarity. I believe it was down one of the tunnel systems. I can't remember exactly now, but it totally led me to this, remembrance of this Thesnactus, whatever that is, oil of Thesnactus.
I'm not familiar with the book of the bee or that particular oil, but it's it's interesting. Um, but anyway, I really can't comment on it except that there's just a lot of strange and unusual things in this world, and sometimes we find these references that uh, you know emulate them or parallel them in some way.
Yeah, could you remind me where it was that you in your book, or Radu's book in his testimony, where it describes this similar type of phenomena being connected to? Um,
I don't remember any issue of giants being trapped.
well,
Uh,
no, not giants. I'm talking about that iron implements not being able to. That when they used iron on it, it
Well, the
left no
stuff
mark.
is much more sophisticated. I mean, the weapons they were using in this book are like high-powered atomic lasers. I mean, an
Hmm.
iron is like nothing.
Yeah, I'll try to when I look again at the material. There was something that was mentioned specifically. I believe it was one of the tunnel systems, and there was something that was directly connected to both the iron implements and also the fire not having any effect on it, which is why I read that particular
Yeah, but
passage.
I mean, I'm just saying is that they're dealing with the most sophisticated
Right,
stuff to where fire and iron are like nothing compared to what we're
right.
talking about here in terms of the America's potential instruments and tools to break a barrier, and they couldn't break it with that. So of
Hmm.
course, fire and iron aren't going to do it.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you because I'm interested, and I don't know if how much you can share on what Radu had seen, and as far as the history, because you mentioned or he mentions within the text that it goes back a very very long time, and that even the projection room itself, that they dated, and I don't recall exactly how they were able to date that as well. Maybe it was with the alignment of the particular star systems, that they said that even the projection room goes back to 50,000 years. But there was a specific mention of some event that had occurred 100,000 years ago, which I think you said that you would be able to elaborate in some way on what that occurrence was, and
The
uh,
only thing that I recall is that he basically says in this book when he talks about looking at the history of the area, other than just seeing this, that, and the other thing, he talks about the the geological tectonic construction of that area is such that it was designed to protect that area from the ice age. Romania was protected.
hmm,
Uh, so this is so, and he watched the changes uh, geologically. Now this is like a fast history of the world,
right,
and but that this was shown to him to show that that area was basically constructed. What's the word? Terraformed
hmm,
to be a preservative of life. Now, the um, if we consider, well, basically the Ice Age, Transylvania was a repository for all life in the continent to recede into during the Ice Age because it remained essentially unfrozen and because it was protected. It's in a protected by the Carpathian Mountains, and to the degree uh, that it wasn't protected, and I'm not saying it wasn't protected, but to the degree it's not protected, it's filled with caves, caves
hmm,
with water. You could live subterranean in that area, in other words, during an ice age. So you could retreat literally into the mundane inner earth. And of course, you can go into caves in Romania that don't end. There's no noticeable end. So if you had I was trying to suggest to one of my friends over there that they put that he has a drone. I said, well, you ever sent the drones into a cave? He says, no, I never thought about it.
that's a good idea.
Yeah. So, yeah. So if you could, send one of these spy drones, boy, you might just go on forever. At some point, there's some form of natural security force that's going to come out. It's not a security force by a government that's going to come out and say you're getting too deep. I would imagine, but everything has its limits. But yeah, well, I guess what I'm alluding to, there is a culture uh, of inner Earth in Transylvania that is that the whole lore and legends are based upon, just as there is in Tibet.
Hmm. Um, can you talk anything as far as any other portion of what he had seen? Do you have any other details on any of the the prior times of history, even in connection to Atlantis or anything of that nature, because what he describes as seeing goes very far back, and I know that he wasn't allowed to speak in great detail on some aspects of it, but if you know anything further than what has been released within the text.
No, I don't know anything further that's been that comes from him that's been released in the text. I think perhaps I think it's book 3, A Mystery of Egypt. He talks about one of the ancient cultures of that area where the people were very simple and they lived off of basically bees and sheep, and they were their consciousness was not in bodies to the degree they had bodies, but they weren't in embedded into them to the degree we are. Life was relatively simple.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly their resources were sheep and bees, and they would have very modest homes, and they'd have a maid, but it was a very sort of serene existence that they had. This is an earlier culture, where the beings were just resonant, exuded resonant harmony. That was one particular thing. He does focus somewhat, and they say not necessarily in the first book. He does mention it on Christ and whatnot, um, but these areas. See, it's also very clear that when one goes into any of these devices, and this is the most important thing, and it's consistent, is that it's bioresonant. What you see of the history is what he sees of the history is not necessarily what you'd see.
Right.
And for all I know, it might be different. If he looked at the uh, history of Caesar being stabbed, it might look different to me. Certainly, it would be from a different angle or cinematographic angle, but it might include different characters. It might. I don't know. I don't know if we're looking into alternative times, but basically, one is, you could ask this question if you gave two people LSD and said, okay, you go back and describe the assassination of Caesar. You go back and describe it, and see what similarities
Mm-hmm.
are actually embedded into the DNA of the respective uh, experimentees. So that this is what how much is that time machine playing off of the DNA of the human being, and his DNA, uh, and how much is it being influenced, and to what degree is it accurate in terms of any objective reference point, and is there such a thing as an objective reference point in any of these matters?
Right. Right. Yeah, because a lot of times they say in quantum physics that the observer has effect on what is actually being observed.
It's a
Um,
good point. That's a very good point, because he might see something and he might change it. His
right.
mind might change it or influence. We have too little experience with these things to be making uh, judgments. We can make interesting stories, but to be making judgments that we can take home with us are it's premature for this sort of thing. Is, of course, what's interesting about the story is that it is a demonstration of exotic potential of the individual. To be able to sit there and watch the history of the world and watch it unfold before you on a video screen is utterly fascinating. Whether it's true or not is a secondary question.
Mm-hmm.
You want to experience whether it's true or not. Just because it folds out in a certain way doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
Doesn't mean
Yeah.
it's at
Absolutely.
all in an objective sense, or doesn't mean it means that you saw one hell of a neat video
Right. Yeah. Totally.
hologram. And then this is the thing, is like, people have this, well, this is this, it's this way, it's that way. And this, you know, there's real no room for these snap judgments.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's a question from the chat room. He wants me to ask you: is Caesar still alive today, and if so, what his involvement is with this ongoing story. I know you did mention in the text that he was involved in exploring other aspects of the tunnel system, and that he met the people from the interior.
Well, I can tell you that from personal letters from Radu to me, that he expressed great disappointment that Caesar was gone. And Caesar had gone into the inner earth to become an ambassador to the beings in the inner earth. And he was very, sad to lose his mentor. Then uh, he mentioned in one letter that Caesar would be back. He affirmed news that he would be back and he will come back someday. Then the next development was that I would meet the alchemist in the second book, Eleanor. That did not happen, and then Radu disappeared after that, and it concerned the publisher very much because he hadn't heard from him. The publisher asked his contact in the government, and they said no, they could do nothing. My intuition tells me that Radu went to join Caesar in some capacity. There was a certain amount of stress involved with him being able to communicate his stories. So, I mean, while it's possible he could have been eliminated, I don't think that's the case, because it's more likely he would have followed in Caesar's footsteps.
When you say that Caesar went to be an ambassador for the people on the inside,
To the people of the inner earth, to the people of the inner earth
to,
from, yes.
okay, what can you elaborate on how, I mean, are they the ones that are, of giant in size? Because the projection room obviously was built for somebody of larger stature.
Well,
Uh,
first of all, we're assuming that requires an assumption that the people in the inner earth that he's being an ambassador to are the same people who built it,
right, yes,
and
true.
that is a complete assumption. So I don't
Yes.
really know, and but what it really suggests is that he is uh, occupying the territory or the region of what are known as the Solomonari, and he is of that, um, you know, of that partaking of that culture. That's what it tells me.
Right.
Size is kind of irrelevant, but and Radu might be following in this order. The one thing I do know of Radu's personality is that he's extremely secretive. So it's possible that he could, be living in Bucharest and just being secretive as hell and being incognito. But he's a very secretive person. In fact, he might overdo it. From my evaluation, is that he might overdo the secrecy. But in any case, this is, what I know. I don't know. As they say, I take this stuff seriously, but everything has to be taken in context, which means with a grain of salt. What does it
Yes.
What does it really mean? People stick on giants a lot. People stick on aliens, ETs. They stick on a lot of things, and they put too much of their attention on, on the uniform rather than on what's really going on behind it. And what are the mechanics behind it, and what does this really mean? It's an initiation of sort. It's a learning. And I will share something. It's from the actual alchemy card in the Aleister Crowley Tarot deck, which it says, and this is, Crowley didn't invent this. It mentions vitriol. But he explains what the vitriol means, and he's not the first one to explain it. But this was also the hallmark of the Rosicrucians. Vitriol basically means, in Latin, visit the interior of the earth, and by rectification thou shalt find the hidden stone. So this alchemical ancient tradition of alchemy is to go into the inner earth, is to pursue the mystery of the inner earth. And by rectification, that shall find the hidden stone. And the hidden stone is the interlocutor between heaven and earth. It's that conduit, that fluid motion. It's just like the person that goes to work and comes into his house. He has a world. He's in the outside world. He's got a job as the boss. He comes home and he's the husband, or he's the single guy living alone in his, in his castle, his man cave, whatever he has. And there's both worlds. So we are souls living in both worlds. We have our outer face that we put on, and then we have our inner face, which is our own private thoughts, etc., relative state of development. And sometimes people get too stuck on the, as I say, the uniform, rather than the process that's going on here.
Have you ever heard of the story of Olaf Janssen? It was written in a book that was published called The Smoky God.
I remember that book. I don't know. I looked at it. I don't really
Remember it?
I remember the name. I remember I've read parts of it, but I couldn't really tell you what it says.
Yeah. Okay, well, the reason I mention is just because he and his father made a trip towards the north, and there's rumor, of the land of Hyperborea, and that there's these people that live up there, and it's basically like paradise. And that William Warren, he published a book called Paradise, the Cradle of Humanity, and he describes it, or places it as being in the North Pole. Well, anyways, they made a journey up there and supposedly went into the interior of the earth, where they were hosted by a group of giant individuals that had very advanced technology, and were, very pleasant to them and very cordial. And also, they stayed there for 2 years, and then they were allowed to return home. But I just thought I'd mention that because there seems to be parallels with some of the stuff we're talking about.
Well, we haven't heard of any story like this where people have had an experience like this, at least in this context, or say like that movie Shangri-La, where they go into a society, in the Himalayas. Of course, it could well be. The only thing I would say is that they mentioned Hyperborea. The word Hyperborea comes from the Greeks, and it literally meant land above the north winds, which
Right.
they designated as anything north of the Danube River. And that meant, you see, Bulgaria is right north of Greece, and north of Bulgaria is the Danube. It separates Romania from Bulgaria, but it referred to Romania. But more specifically, because north of Wallachia, which is bordered by the Carpathian Mountains, north of the Carpathians is Transylvania. And that is your region of Hyperborea, which extends right into the inner earth. So the Hyperborean, the Greeks will refer to Apollo and Diana as Hyperboreans. And Apollo and Diana were twins. And they were twins that made up an archetype of the ancient Romanian god who I mentioned before, Zalmoxis. Zalmoxis was symbolized by the symbol Gemini for two, but his actual two, the Gemini symbol looks like a Latin numeral 2, Roman numeral 2. But this real symbol for Zalmoxis was the swastika. The swastika looks like a 2, superimposed upon another 2. And it represented, this was from the age of Gemini, which was twins. And this would have been the prototype for the word Hyperborea and all it represented, because the Greeks adopted all of these Thracian gods. That land was once known as Thracia,
Right.
or Dacia, and adopted them
and converted them into names, and the Romans did the same thing. They changed the names around. Um, so, but the legends that this Olaf man talks about, they could be very well experiences that he had in a different context than we normally experience in real life, and they could indeed be true.
Yeah, well, I want to let the listening audience know we're going to have Peter on with us next week and the following week. If you have any questions that you'd like me to ask him in specific, just email me at zen
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Most are afraid of unknown depths, skirting shores thinking world flat, and with the island girls in celebration of new religion. Nobody led me or said this way. I sailed alone on makeshift raft with wind as companion. Fate for deliverance, confidence enough to assess new disposition. Seekers of lost paradise may seem fools to those who never sought the other worlds. Welcome to Momentary Zen with Zen Garcia. Visit www.fallenangels.tv. You're listening to Revolution Radio.
As little as long ago, or as far away as forever. This is where we meet to celebrate what never was as it comes to pass. Welcome, friends. I'm your host, Zen Garcia. This is Momentary Zen here on Revolution Radio, and we're broadcasting for the next 2 hours, and we come to you every Wednesday evening, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern on Studio B. Thank those of you that have taken time to join us this evening and that are in the chat room. Welcome, and thank you for the fellowship. I consider you to be very wise in your research, and as you learn from me, I also learn from you. Today, I have as guests with me for the next 2 hours and also for the next 3 Wednesdays, Peter Moon, who's the author of several books, and he's the publisher over there at Sky Books as well. And he's got a very unique and interesting connection to not only the Preston Nichols and the Montauk experiments, and but also with the Buscegi, I believe is the name, the way that you say it, the Hall of Records that was discovered, which is said to be 50,000 years old over there in Romania, and which broke, it seems, over a decade ago, even though it's still an ongoing story and something that the world is still waking up to. And it's, I believe, to be a very important event, and it certainly seems to um, connect to the prior times in some form of fashion. And so I'm hoping to gain further introspection as far as what Peter can share with us. I know that there are some things that are still hush hush and related to this story, but whatever you can elaborate on would be greatly appreciated. Peter, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. And well, before we go into discourse on those things that we've been talking about and mentioned, would you give out your website information?
Family were in town, and to my surprise, they wanted to go to Montauk. I said, oh, okay. I hadn't been there since last year. And so we went out to Montauk, and he just sent me a picture today of. And I said, well, he says, Montauk Energy, he says. And I said, what was that? My gosh. I said, was that the sun? He says, no, that wasn't the sun. The sun wasn't in that direction. So he gets this like weird, God, it looked like a globe of light. Now, there were pictures taken out there a year ago where they had these blue, they weren't orbs. You'll often see blue orbs in certain pictures around certain highly charged areas. These were like, they were a little bit like the blue orbs, except they looked like sort of like big lips kissing, like really fat lips kissing. And so that there is phenomena out there. Most definitely there's phenomena out there, and there will probably always be phenomena out there.
Do you think that something like the Bermuda Triangle was created or opened, and that is still, still ongoing and affecting even time, space now in that particular area?
The commonalities, I mean, in I do not consider myself that studied up on the Bermuda Triangle,
Hmm.
but from what, and there's even been arguments that it's, in any region of space that had that much traffic flying through it, it would have that much odd occurrences. But let's just assume that the occurrences in the Bermuda Triangle are odd. Well, it could be any number of things, but the most, I guess, what you'd say, I wouldn't call it conventional. I would call it, alternative traditional would be that it was a giant crystal underneath that represented the Atlantean culture. It was underneath the ocean that was askew, and that's one explanation that's been offered. Montauk itself is said to be an ancient Atlantean mountaintop. Keep in mind that Montauk is a mountain. It is not a part of Long Island geographically. It is actually an island, and it is the connection between Montauk and Long Island is called the Napeague Strip. For all practical purposes, if you're driving along, it'll look like land, but it's really an isthmus that was filled in. So basically you have a different geological structure. Now, when I say Atlantis, it's very important to realize that Atlantis is more of a time period than it is an island or a continent. And it was a culture that is, I think its last remnants are said to be, and as I say, I don't consider myself expert on this topic, 10,000 years ago. And there were different variations of Atlantis, just like there were different variations of Egypt. So yeah, there is perhaps technology that went askew in many different areas of the planet.
Well, you had mentioned HARP, and then you said that it was multi-layered. Can you elaborate? What do you think is, what's connected to HARP? What are they actually?
In Boston, this is where the fathers of, or the sons of liberty plotted against the British government. That's what it felt like. The era of conspiracy was so thick you could cut it with a knife. That nowadays it's, anybody can talk about conspiracy, and it's not that you couldn't talk about it, but it just felt like the paradigm was still had not shifted, and we were like, the stuff we were talking about was so over the edge of what was then considered to be reality. So in any case, I met Preston and he talked about the Montauk Project, and he was giving it was a panel discussion on Earth changes. Next to him was Duncan Cameron, who was the lead psychic in the Montauk experiments. And basically and in the audience that night next to me was Al Bielek, who I met. The Montauk Project was a catch-all phrase for vast amounts of experimentation that was done starting in the 1940s after the aftermath of the Philadelphia experiment, which was an experiment when the Navy was monkeying around with a ship called the USS Eldridge and attempting to make it appear invisible to radar. And it did much more than appear invisible to radar. It disappeared and it moved in time. And the tragedy of the Philadelphia experiment was for the people on board, the sailors, who were put into what I could now describe as the boundary layer between self-contained or soliton field, which basically accompanied one rate of time, and the outside world, which consisted of another rate of time. And between these two, this bubble reality, or these two rates of time, was a field of energy that was basically irradiated, and it hurt the sailors who were in it or close to it. And it not only could hurt them physically, in some cases where they were just close to it, it discombobulated them mentally. So the physical, mental, and emotional trauma that accompanied this experiment, the sailors after 1943 were taken to Camp Upton in Long Island, New York, which was to be the home of, actually became Brookhaven National Laboratory, the foremost laboratory on atomic science at the time, and it still is. And it was actually a bunch of universities that owned it. Now it's actually owned by the Department of Energy in the U.S. government. So that was the beginning of the Montauk Project, when they were studying these sailors, and then as they began to study them further, they began to try and link their minds and affect it with radio frequency. And this was connecting the mind of man to radio frequency, amplification of radio frequency, and also connecting it to computers. Because the man who ran this project, John von Neumann, was one of the fathers of computer science. So this project took place in the late 40s, early 50s, and carried forward to 1958, when there was the government ordered the product shut down because of the mind control aspects, but it went under the table, and it reemerged in the early 70s at the end of Long Island, eastern end of Long Island, Montauk Point, where there was an Air Force station that had a huge radar reflector that operated at what's called the window frequency to the human consciousness, 435 megahertz, or anywhere approximately 420 to 450 megahertz. And this was, they were able to basically have a psychic who was mentally adept, who could broadcast thoughts that would be amplified and transmitted out of that, the gain horn of the radar reflector, which is basically a transmitter. The radar reflector would transmit and it would also receive. But it would affect the local population, it would affect the animals, and this sort of thing. And eventually, if you can affect moods and you can affect matter, which they could affect matter, they were able to affect time. And this was, the accounts of the experiments are varied, they're subjective, but there's enough circumstantial evidence to know that a project of a highly irregular nature that followed mood control, that it allowed for mood control of human emotions. And there have been so many anecdotal accounts of time phenomena that the story has really weathered the test of decades, a score of years. And then of course now we have further examples and corroboration through the work of Dr. David Anderson, which establishes that time travel does not violate the laws of math and physics.
Well, is there anything still ongoing associated with the phenomena and with the uh, gateways or portals which were open? Is there any still residual effects lingering from the things that were done during that time?
Well, I would have to say there's always a residual.
Mm.
If you, what the Montauk Project evolved into, at least in part, was the HARP project in Alaska. It evolved into this, huge, multi-layered program that affects the Earth's atmosphere. It affects God knows what. The HARP project is multi-layered, as all these government projects are that are of a highly esoteric nature. So that does not mean that everything in the Montauk Project evolved into the HARP project and it didn't siphon off into somewhere else. But when you talk about a residual, I will tell you this. My two members of my
Information where people can go to find your many different books, and if you would tell us how many you've published, because you are a very prolific writer.
Well, there's 20 books that I've published. I've authored or co-authored about 15 or 16 of them, and 16, I think. And the website to look at the books, the brief description of the books and see the covers is skybooks.usa.com, skybooks.usa.com. And to access our free videos on the new series, Time Travel Theory Explained, go to digitalmontauk.com, and the lead post there, you'll go right, it'll tell you how to access these videos. There's 7 videos that explain the math and physics of time travel.
Excellent. Well, for those that maybe have not heard of Preston Nichols and Al Bielek and the story in connected with Montauk and its connections to the Philadelphia experiment and others, would you mind sharing kind of a brief synopsis on that story, and also kind of talk about what it was that you learned in, in studying and just examining that whole occurrence?
Okay, first thing I'm going to say is, in very short order, within a month's time, I will be releasing a 5-6 minute video synopsis of the Montauk Project Experiments in Time, the first book that I co-wrote and published with Preston Nichols. And then the second book, Montauk Revisited, Adventures in Synchronicity, Pyramids of Montauk, the Black Sun, and also a short 5-minute video on the Montauk Pulse newsletter, which is still in print today. It's been in print over 23 years, and it keeps people up to date on the events that I've been involved in. So there will be a way to get people up to a date on this stuff, or at least a mini introduction in 5 minutes on video with pictures and whatnot. So that's been being worked on for the last month, and it's coming, to a finish. Now, to address your question, the Montauk Project Experiments in Time, which I learned about from Preston Nichols after attending a meeting of the Long Island chapter of the U.S. Psychotronics Association on Long Island in November 7th, 1990. That's when I met Preston Nichols. And since then, it took me about 6 months of going to those meetings. They'd have 2 every month, to learn a lot of the different legends, lore, stories, and also meeting some of the people who were either involved or peripherally involved. And this was not broadcast for public dissemination. In fact, when we were hearing this information, and of course it's about time travel experiments and mind control experiments that accompanied the time travel, it felt like we were in Faneuil Hall in Boston, which is known as the Cradle of Liberty